day before Thanksgiving, so people will be gone, I'm sure, or baking or something. So,
Did you hear that?
so we did go through the plague of locusts and how devastating that was. And still, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. I heard a term the other day that when a person continues to resist God, their heart gets calcified, which is another nice terminology there that kind of explains it. But I think that's really true in everybody's life, that when you resist what you know is clearly God's word, your heart gets hard. And there comes a point where God will harden the heart then too. And just an analogy to that, I remember when I coached 8th grade basketball with a friend, and he just told the kids, he says, now when you get to high school, he says, and you're not listening to the coach, he's going to start talking to you less and less. And you're going to find yourself farther and farther down the bench. And that's kind of an analogy of what happens to us or anyone when you don't listen to God. And we talked about that locusts in the Bible are often very symbolic of judgment. This was a plague that in some sense was a natural plague. The timing of it was supernatural. We talked about there's a place where there's in Joel where it talks about the locusts that come, the 3 different ones. And it might be symbolic probably of the 3 armies that are going to come and destroy Israel. And at this point too, he does have kind of a fake repentance, because he's had kind of a little bit of a foxhole conversion, where things have gotten bad, so he says, yeah, I didn't mean it, I'm sorry. But as soon as the locusts left, it was back to business as normal. And that's pretty typical, I think, of foxhole conversions too, is that once the pressure's off, and I'm sure, I know that happened, I think that comes from World War I, when they were down in the trenches. God, when I get back, if you get me out of this, I promise never to drink again. Then the 9th plague was the darkness, and that was a mockery, of course, of the god Ra, which was one of the main gods. And that certainly was a supernatural event. And then, you can't quite picture it, but in Goshen, it was light. I mean, that's pretty hard to do, to blacken out just part of a land area for 3 days. And it was more than just, oh, it's dark. It was a darkness that could be felt. And that's kind of scary, And we talked about being in a cave, on a tour, and they say, okay, put your hand in front of your face, and then they turn off the switch, you don't see anything. So it was like that. And at this point, he wants to compromise. He says, you know what, you can go, but, and Moses would have nothing of it because God would have nothing of it. It's not partial obedience, it's total obedience in our lives. So once again, his hard heart. And then the last plague now, which we're going to be talking about today more. So, obedience without understanding. If you didn't know the backstory of this, how this was going to, portray the coming Messiah, and all of this, and it was all symbolic, you'd have a tendency to think, I would anyways, like, wait a minute, this sounds kind of strange. But they obeyed anyways. That was the key. And then we're going to talk about the favor with the Egyptians. We're going to talk about the symbolism. And we're going to listen to the song, When I See the Blood, which was unfamiliar to most of you. And then finally, he's going to say, okay, get out of here.
Don't let the door hit you in the back, so
What was that?
don't let the door hit you.
Don't let the door hit you, right? But it's interesting, we're trying to talk about how the Egyptians do things at this point. So we'll see if it comes in here.
And this mixed choir is going to be leading out in.
The words are on the back of one of your sheets.
Lifted up on the first. Christ, our Redeemer. Christ, our Redeemer. Died on the cross. Died for the sin. Paid all his due. Sprinkled your soul with the blood of the Lamb. And I will pass over you. When I see the blood.
Kind of a classic way of doing that. You can tell that was maybe 10, 12 years ago, because everybody was wearing a suit tie.
But there was no raising of hand.
No, I don't think, it was probably a Baptist church there, I bet.
Wasn't Pentecostal.
I don't think so, no. If it was Pentecostal too, they would have had an altar call after. Yeah, that's, I mean, that is such a rich song.
Yeah.
I mean, and the symbolism of the Passover is so clearly portrayed, you know, in our Christian lives today. You know, judgment is coming, you know, and that's what God told the Israelites too. Judgment's coming now. This is it. But you can be saved. You do this. And it wasn't like, well, I'm just going to do parts 1, 2, and I'm going to skip 3, 4, 5. No. No, you needed to do it all.
It's all.
Yeah. And, you know, if somebody had said, well, I'm just going to go out and try to see this angel coming. No, you weren't protected. I mean, sometimes people will do that when tornadoes are coming. I want to go out and take a look. Bob does that.
I used to go stand on the roof and look. Can't get on the roof anymore.
Yeah. So, You know, the verse, like we said, the judgment is coming, all will be there, each one receiving justly his due. Hide in the saving, sin cleansing blood, and I will pass over you. You know, there is in liberal churches a movement, you know, where you don't want to talk about the blood, because that kind of offends people. And that's the key. Without the shedding of blood, there
A
is
lot
no
of
remission.
Bibles have left it out now too.
Yeah, or songs too, they've modified some songs to change them, to make them more
And
acceptable.
the News for Modern Man is the one I think of.
Oh, okay.
That's left it out, and I don't remember the other ones.
Well, God did make sure, or Moses made sure now that he emphasized too now that the people always remember this day. Always remember this process. Always do this in remembering to teach your children. You know, it doesn't take many generations for truth to be lost. You know, this was a very visual type event too. You know, you always say, well, hands-on activities are best for learning. Well, they learned by visual. It wasn't just Moses saying, and this is what, you know, blah, 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 you know. Yeah. Because we all easily forget, and we learn better, of course, with a visual. You know, Moses wrote Psalms 105. We mentioned that last time. And I'm going to read that. And it's interesting, you know, that with all on Moses' plate, he still had time to write a psalm. That was nice. Sometime in his tent at night. So he says, thank God, pray to him by name, tell everyone you meet what he has done. Sing him songs, belt out hymns, translate his wonders into music. Lois wouldn't have been like that. Right? Jacob immigrated to the land of Ham. God gave his people lots of babies. Soon their numbers alarmed their foes. He turned the Egyptians against his people. They abused and cheated God's servants. Then he sent his servant Moses and Aaron, whom he also chose. They worked marvels in that spiritual wasteland, miracles in the land of Ham. He spoke darkness and it turned dark. They couldn't see what they were doing. He turned all their water to blood, so all the fish died. He made frogs swarm through the land, even into the king's bedroom. He gave the word and flies swarmed. Gnats filled the air. He substituted hail for rain. He stabbed their land with lightning. He wasted their vines and fig trees. He smashed their groves of trees to splinters. With the word he brought in locusts, millions of locusts, armies of locusts. They consumed every blade of grass in the country and picked the ground clean of produce. He struck down every firstborn in the land, the firstfruits of their virile powers. He led Israel out, their arms filled with loot, and not one among his tribes even stumbled. Egypt was glad to have them go because they were scared to death of them. So an interesting thumbnail sketch of the whole deal, of that whole chapter. So we've gone through chapters 1 through 11, and chapters 1 through 11 is about the deliverer, Moses. Now chapters 12 through 14 is on the deliverance. So an important distinction there. So let's read chapter Exodus 12, 1 through 3 to get started in kind of a new chapter here. Exodus 12, 1 through 3. Somebody got that?
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first of month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for for his household.
So God is dealing with individuals and he's dealing with the families. And it's in this part now of Exodus is really the high point of the whole book of Exodus. You know, this is 0 hour. So the countdown has begun. Remember, back when Moses first came to the people, they thought, easy schmeezy, this is gonna, you know, tomorrow we're leaving. We don't know how long that process took, if it was years or months. The Bible doesn't really say. It must have been a fairly long time when we talked about they were able to replenish some of the cattle and things like that. So now the symbolism of Passover is so rich. And we mentioned how 20 some years ago we did have some Messianic Jews come and do a Seder with us and go through all of the symbolism, and we actually partook. We did that with our homeschool group too, where it was, and once again, you remember stuff so much more if you're using your senses. So you're tasting the food, you're going to remember it a lot better. So we have a little summary here of get this. So the summary which you have of the Passover meal. So it symbolizes, the freedom from bondage and the whole Exodus. The lamb, which of course is symbolic of Christ. That's so clear in the Bible. The roasted egg, which was symbolic of, I have some more information here. The bitter herbs. Now the roasted egg wasn't in the original Passover, that's in new ones. The bitter herbs, the bitterness of being in slavery, that was usually horseradish in a modern one. The unleavened bread, leaven of course symbolizes what in the Bible?
Sin.
Sin, yeah, sin, right. And so they were not, and then following the Passover, there was the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days where they weren't supposed to eat any. And part of it too was they didn't have time to mix in the yeast and let it rise. They were supposed to just get going right away. But then they had food too that would last when they had to make that trip to the shores of the Red Sea. And then that carousel, which is a sweet mixture. Once again, it's not mentioned in the Old Testament. It is mentioned in modern Seders. The carpus, the green parsley, symbolizing the hyssop, which they would use to spread the blood. The ceremonial cups. Now, once again, that wasn't in the original, but Christ uses those cups. And then the Passover is not just the past, but reminds us of God's continued presence through the whole time. And then in a modern Seder too, they always have an empty chair. So we have a few empty chairs. If Elijah wants to bring his friends, we can have room for them today.
Yeah, what's interesting is a few years ago, the Jewish Seder that I went to, they went through this feast, but they served chicken
Oh,
instead of lamb. And I don't see anywhere in the Bible that, that anybody representing a chicken died for me.
no. Now that kind of loses its punch, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, lamb is pretty expensive, so.
And they did say that was their reason.
Yeah. They could have used tofu or whatever that is. but-
Yeah, tofu.
Yeah, tofu, yeah. Now, the Holy Week, the Easter week is also very symbolic, what Christ went through that week. Now, it mentioned in that first passage there how it began on the 10th day of Nisan, also known as the month of Abib. And it fell on a Sunday, and so that's why we call, in our celebration, we call it Palm Sunday or Passion Sunday. Now, this was the day that the male lambs are chosen. Interesting. What happened on Palm Sunday? Jesus came into Jerusalem. This is the day Jesus rode into the city. John identifies the day before Jesus rode into Jerusalem, Saturday, as 6 days before Passover. In the ancient world, when one counted a sequence, one counted from the day that it started, the sequence is number one. So sometimes there's it seems like discrepancies, but they're not about the number of days. It's how they counted days. So the lambs chosen for sacrifice by each family, and they must be visible in that family for 5 days. So what did Jesus do during that week? He was in the temple. He was visible. He was making himself known. He was being judged. Because during that 5 days, they were supposed to examine that lamb and make sure that it was perfect. It didn't have any blemish. Jesus was examined by the chief priests and scribes. They didn't find anything wrong with him during that week. So that symbolism is really rich too. So for 5 days, the perfect Lamb of God preached at the temple in Jerusalem, where everyone could see him. He wasn't hiding. So on the 14th day of Nisan, that's a Thursday, Jesus sent Peter and John into Jerusalem to see that a room he has selected for the feast is prepared. Everything's ready. This is the day the lambs are sacrificed at the temple. The lambs were sacrificed at the hour of the second daily sacrifice. The ceremony began at 12 noon, when the second lamb of the daily sacrifice was brought out and tied to the altar. At the end of the ceremony, the lambs or kids that each family brought to be sacrificed are taken home and prepared for the feast that night. Sacrificial animal was to be roasted whole, no bones broken, which is also significant too. And the roasting is symbolic of judgment in a sense. They were instructed by, don't eat any, we're going to get to that, don't eat anything raw. So then sundown on the 15th, at sundown, the beginning of that day, Friday, Jewish time, but Thursday night our time, Jesus and his disciples gathered at the upper room to celebrate the feast. Everything that took place in the Old Covenant sacrificial meal of the Feast of Unleavened Bread prefigured the Passion of Christ. After the meal, remember, Jesus is arrested while praying. At dawn, he is condemned by the Jewish court and sent to the Roman governor. Pilate, Jesus is essentially selected for sacrifice. Remember, one of the high priests said, we need to have one guy die for the nation. Which was, he didn't know it, but he was prophesying. And he was an ungodly man. But selected for sacrifice by the high priest. Just as Caiaphas selected the perfect male lambs for the daily sacrifice. At dawn, the first lamb of the daily sacrifice taught the altar. This is the 6th day of the week, the day man was created. When Jesus was sent to Pilate, they didn't enter the praetorium themselves, for they had to avoid ritual impurity if they were to eat the Passover supper. So it was interesting too. Remember, Pilate was the one that declared Jesus perfect. He says, I find no fault in this man. I find no fault in this Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. He didn't know that, but once again, he was part of that process, not knowing that. So So when Jesus is crucified on the cross, just as the first lamb of the daily sacrifice is offered up on the altar in the temple, and the people attend the Feast of Unleavened Bread ceremonies at the temple and eat the Shagagod offering at the hour of the first daily sacrifice, 12 noon, the sun goes dark. Total eclipse at this time of the month is not according to the laws of astronomy. It was a miracle. A total eclipse cannot take place during a full moon. And this feast is begun on the 15th day of the month, in the middle of the month, on the day in which the moon is full of light, in consequence of the providence of God taking care that there should be no darkness on that day. The festival calendar was a lunar calendar. So then on Saturday, Jesus rests in the tomb. On the 17th, the Feast of First Fruits has begun. First day after the Sabbath of Passover week, and that's our Resurrection Sunday. And according to the law, this feast was celebrated the day after the first Sabbath of Passover. It signaled the beginning of the harvest when the people present first fruits of the barley. God prescribes this feast would always fall on Sunday. The day we call Sunday was the first day of the week and the first day of creation in Genesis. Saturday is the seventh day. The day of Jesus' resurrection was the day of new creation, when all creation was renewed in the resurrection of the Son of God. I mean, there's so much there that we kind of gloss over when we read, Holy Week, or even have Easter week, Catholics probably do a better job of celebrating, the whole, Christ's death on the cross and Easter week, and having Wednesdays come in and get the Ash Wednesdays, and maybe it's kind of an empty ritual for some, but there is meaning behind all of that, and it probably may be lost sometimes in the shuffle. So, any comments or questions on that part of it? Anything that hit you?
Well, one thing I've noticed before is, when the lamb is sacrificed, in the ancient Jewish ritual, there's a goat that's led out into the desert. The sins of the people are placed on the goat.
Yeah.
And it was generally a Gentile that they used to lead the goat out into the desert for 3 days and then turn it loose. And there's symbolism there too, in that it was Romans, Gentiles, that took Jesus to the cross, and he spent 3 days, in the tomb, outside of the city or in the wilderness, and then he was let go on the third day. He was released, he resurrected. So there's that symbolism of that too.
And one thing I didn't realize too, that instead of a lamb, they could have a baby goat. So, okay, so chapter 12 now, 4 through 6. If you want to look there, each member of the family must come under the protection of the blood. Now, the Israelites were spared from previous plagues, but this one's different. They need now to be redeemed and exhibit faith in the blood. This is also the first plague that actually targeted human beings for death. The other ones were more of a discomfort and an annoyance in some ways. I mean, more than an annoyance. And now a little footnote here on Christmas. Many people think that the shepherds that were around Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth, they were the shepherds that raised the perfect little lambs for the temple. That was where they got the lambs for the temple sacrifices, which is interesting that would be, once again, be around that time when Jesus was born. I don't know if the shepherds, understood all the symbolism. They probably didn't, but so God was looking at all the thousands of lambs as just one. So all the ones that were sacrificed that night, God looked down and saw just the one perfect lamb, that Christ. So, how were people saved in the Old Testament? Well, it was the blood looking forward to Christ's coming. Okay, so check verses 7 through 9. They take the blood and spread it on the doorpost. All inside will be protected. Now, just as young children before the age of accountability will be saved, the young children who did not understand all that was going on, they were saved as well. And they were also taken out of Egypt. Just because they didn't understand didn't mean that they weren't going along with the rest of them out and being saved from bondage as well. So the lamb is eaten, the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. We discussed those earlier, what the importance of that. And then, one thing that's often overlooked, no bones were broken in the lamb. What do we know about Christ on the cross? When they came to break his legs, he was already dead. They put the spear in his side, but no bones were broken. Well, what about putting the nails through? Well, they talk about that, how there is a space in between your carpals here, where that's where they would put it. If they put it in the hand, there was nothing to hold it in place and it would rip out. So here you're putting it in the middle where all your carpal bones are. And there is a little place they would feel for it. There's a little spot that the spike would go. And so none of those bones, the carpal bones weren't broken either when they put it in. That's what they talk about. Those Romans that did the crucifixions, they were very methodical. And the other thing, that you hear, there was the swoon theory. Jesus was taken down off the cross and he woke up in the tomb. They were not going to let anybody off that cross that was still partly alive. If they did, they'd be the next one probably crucified. So you're not going to do your job right. So, and like we mentioned, that's also there that fire is a symbolic of judgment to be roasted. They were not to eat it raw. So then verses 11 through 12, I want somebody to read that.
This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On the same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord.
Mm-hmm. So, you're going to eat it in haste. Your mom always told you, don't scarf your food. Chew your food. Good. Well, they were probably saying, hurry up, Junior, and the interesting there too, that judgment was against all the gods of Egypt. That's what we've been talking about. And there he says it real clearly. This is against the people and against the gods. It was interesting too that often some of these gods, they demanded the offering of the firstborn to them. And now God is saying, okay, this is what's going to happen to your firstborn. So then verses 13, here's the famous phrase which we've been talking about. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. And once again, it's a matter of obedience. It wasn't that, and if you're circumcised, I will pass over you. It wasn't like you were really nice to your neighbor. It was when I see the blood, symbolic of Christ's shed blood. That's how people are saved. And of course, growing in so many denominations today, it's, well, I'm a good person, so I'm going to heaven. funerals, sadly, in a lot of liberal churches, that's basically what they say. You're all going. This person was really a nice person, and they don't mention. And they accepted Christ when they were 10, and lived for Christ. So they were not to go out of the house at all during that night, and stay in shelter and trust the blood to do what God promised. I can imagine it was a pretty scary time. And you would hear perhaps the screams all the way from Egypt of the people crying out.
I've heard it described where when the blood was put on the doorpost, on the lintel, and like they would probably do it in the center, and then on each side would form the cross. If you draw the lines, they would form the cross. I've seen it described that.
And once again, not knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in verses 14 through 16 now, he's reminding them, now keep this as a lasting reminder. And later the Feast of Unleavened Bread is instituted too, where they were to eat as a remembering too of eating that leavened bread that they made the night before. The feast was no salvation. This Feast of Unleavened Bread, that wasn't the same as the Passover, but it was supposed to be kind of a fellowship time in the home of remembering all of these things, and probably through oral tradition passing on these things to their children, what had taken place. Once again, always remember what happened here. And too often now, even in America, they talk about we live in a nation now that has a Christian memory. Well, you even wonder now if we have a Christian memory anymore. We talked in Sunday school how a man was saying that he thinks we live in a pre-Christian world, like Rome was. And in Sunday school, we're talking about, of course, the clash of the cultures when Paul goes to Athens. At least Athens people, most of them, they kind of listened. They didn't just throw rocks at them right away. Okay. So, and the thing about leaven again too, Jesus made it clear, a little leaven can spoil a whole bunch. Kind of like, we modernized it, one bad apple spoils the whole barrel. So that first plague, like I said, actually killed people. Verses 31 through 33, if you skip ahead, now Pharaoh finally relents. He could have spared his people in the country, the whole country, from the pain. If he had just said the first time Moses came and said, okay, I'm not going to fight God. Your God is bigger than our God. At least after that third, when the magicians couldn't match things. So it's interesting too. He says, and bless me too. Well, that's interesting that he would even acknowledge that. Losing a child is deeply hurtful. And even Pharaoh's heart had to be melted some by that whole thing. All the people were scared stiff in Egypt. They're thinking, okay, what would happen next? Let's say there's an 11th plague. What's God going to do? Are all of us going to be wiped out? And would all of us die? And so they're saying, hey, Pharaoh, just give up, let him go. And they exalted Moses. They thought he was a great guy. Now that wasn't always true. So verses 34 through 38, I want to look there. they took their unleavened dough. The Egyptians, interesting, paid them back wages. So they're giving them all of these goodies. They're saying, hey, take this, you know, forgive me almost, you know. Please don't bring any more plagues, just go. And these gold items, of course, you know, we wonder, so where did they get all of this gold and silver to help, you know, fund the tabernacle and make things out of gold? And even when Aaron said, you know, we'll bring all your gold necklaces and earrings and rings and we'll make a god that, you know, he made the golden calf. That's where they got this. So it says that 600,000 men. Now, if you translate that, that's not counting women, which are probably at least an equal number.
And no children either.
And no children counted either. Let's say they at least had 2 or 3. I mean, they were pretty prolific. So we know that, you know, they had a lot of babies. And so it's probably maybe more close to 2 million at least. Now that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people to supply food for. But it said none of them stumbled. They were all, you know, strong. And maybe those that were a little bit infirm, maybe they carried them. I don't know. And it says a mixed multitude went with them as well. So there were Gentiles, and maybe many of them were sincere. Maybe they had believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But J. Vernon McGee points out, he says he thinks this mixed multitude later caused problems in some cases. Because later during the conquest of Israel, Israel and the Assyrians brought in other groups and they became Samaritans. So later on, this same type of thing happened. You have a mixed multitude in Samaria. You have the people intermarrying with people that the Assyrians brought in, and their religion was diluted and mixed. And Jesus, you know, confronted that when he saw the woman at the well. So this mixed multitude might have been the ones that kind of led the rebellion a little bit, like, hey man, you know, things were pretty good back in Egypt, at least for us, you know. But that they would really have that short a memory is kind of remarkable. But, you know, maybe if we were there too, we'd be doing the same thing. But I think it was clear that if they wanted to join them, God always allowed Gentiles in to the fold if they were willing to follow the rules. And, you know, this mixture might have been, maybe there was an Egyptian man that married or an Israelite man that married an Egyptian woman. That was probably more possible than vice versa.
In verse 43, however, it says, no foreigner is to eat of it.
Right? Yeah?
So, how does
To
that
eat of
fit
it.
in with what you're saying?
But they must have been in the household, at least protected by the blood. Don't you think?
I don't know. It says, no foreigner is to eat of it. Any slave you have bought may eat of it after you have circumcised him, but a temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it.
Not eat at the Passover, right?
Right, and if they don't eat of the Passover,
Yeah,
they're not
that's-
allowed,
that's-
right?
Right. But you have Ruth, that was a Moabitess that came into the fold. We don't, yeah.
Okay, but that wasn't during the Passover.
No,
We're
right.
talking about the Passover.
Yeah, but maybe these are some that lost their firstborn son. And they're saying, now we want to go.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe.
It's a good question, though.
An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in his household circumcised. Then he may take part,
Yeah.
like the one born in the land.
Yeah. So maybe they got a quick circumcision on the road.
Well,
Good gracious, they were busy.
It's kind of like now too, I mean, they had to observe the law that in order for them to take part in the Passover, you know, they had to be circumcised, they had to proclaim themselves
Right, to be
as Jews
truly-
by religion.
Yeah.
For us to take communion, it's a requirement that you need to have Jesus as your Savior.
Yeah.
So that's
Accept the
kind of
blood.
along that
Yeah.
same line.
Yeah, accept the blood as sacrifice.
Right.
Right? So verse 38 through 42, he gives a little bit of a summary. Somebody read those 4 verses.
His multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flock and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt, and they could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. You went to 42?
42, yeah.
The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations.
Yeah. 430 years. It's a long way.
To the day.
Went
To the day.
from 12 to 2 million.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's a long time no matter what. You know, you think of America's history, 430 years ago. It's a long time ago. A lot happened in those 430 years. And you wonder sometimes, why wasn't it shorter? So they left in haste, and now in chapter 13, they come to the cul-de-sac. They come to the Red Sea, and they're getting the directions from the Lord. This is the way you're going to go. And they get to a place where they're really locked in. It is really a cul-de-sac. The only way out is to come back the way you came. And who's coming on the way you came?
The Egyptians.
The Egyptians, right? Because Pharaoh has changed his mind again. He's probably thinking, wait a minute, what did I just do? He says, think of all the free labor we had. You know, who's going to be building all my, treasure houses and stuff like that? So, and of course, God hardened his heart. And he was going to show once again. And you wonder if his generals are thinking, this is a bad idea. Just like, we made the reference to Hitler and his hard heart, and his generals, Rommel and some of those other guys, when he came up with some of his plans, they're saying, wait a minute, that's not a good idea. But you never said no to Hitler, apparently. And I don't think we should invade Russia and stay there in the winter. Yeah, I think if they had listened to Rommel, things might have been a little bit better. But it seems at this point now they're stuck, and then they hear the thundering hooves. And the Red Sea's in front of them, Pharaoh's armies behind them. What are we going to do? And the human response is, of course, what are you trying to do? Kill us? After all that had happened, within at least the last year or whatever, or just that the Passover was really recent. And it really shows at this point, I think, the maturity of Moses. Because Moses doesn't get flustered. He's not complaining to God yet. Yeah, God, what are you doing here? I didn't want to go here in the first place. So we see that the way he handles it is pretty clear. And God is not going to let them go down. Let me, if I can get it up real quick here. Probably one of the most iconic scenes. And you have we have that little cartoon there of, yeah. And that's probably, if that was today, that probably would be pretty good. So hopefully get, okay. 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 And if we can't get it wiggled in good enough. I think this is Tom's favorite scene from the Ten Commandments. Okay. This might be copyrighted, I suppose.
What's interesting to me is, at this point in history, back in Egypt, there is no mention in their historical records of this happening. But there is a time when a fairly young pharaoh suddenly was no longer pharaoh anymore, there was somebody in his place.
Yeah, because the victors write the history books.
Right?
He didn't want that on his record.
Yeah, no explanation of why they changed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Swindoll says, like, the one thing that's missing from that scene is that, if they had just gone in right away, it would have been pretty muddy. And so that was the wind that went through to dry it out before they went in. I mean, I guess God could have said poof,
Right, yeah. And again, there's no time frame.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they were blocked, the Egyptians were blocked by a wall of fire that they couldn't get there.
And yet they still went.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, you notice he said to his men, better to die, don't be a chicken, it's better to die brave, and then he stays,
Yeah.
I don't think the Bible says that he died in it, but all the chariots.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pharaoh died in it.
So he went back home with his tail between his legs. And if there had been an election, if there had called for an election with Parliament, I think he would have lost. Okay, well, thank you for coming. We'll continue 2 weeks from now, because next week we'll take off. So spread the word on that on the newsletter too, right?
Thanksgiving.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you.